welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Excellent. Can we start with a slightly broad question around cows and climate and methane more generally? You know, the topic of today's discussion is tackling the methane moment. When we say methane moment, what do we mean, and why is this window different from methane moments in the past, maybe 5 or 10 years? So, Elizabeth, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, thank you so much for having EDF be a part of the Economist session here. Methane is the single biggest thing that the food and ag sector can address that will make a difference as to when we get to net zero and how painful or not so painful it will be. And as such, it is just the opportunity that can pull the emergency brake on climate change. And so as a result, it's just really worth focusing on. And I very much believe that companies in particular have an opportunity to really accelerate this action in this super important space.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Andy, any additional thoughts or just open question to the panel? Anyone want to jump in?
I mean, what Elizabeth said. I mean, I think, I'd say there should be a methane moment. I'd question whether we have that moment right now. I mean, I think this is an area of massive underinvestment right now. But this should be the thing that's getting talked about as a real, tangible means of slowing climate change down right now.
So maybe we're not in the moment quite yet, and we could just talk about it. We need to translate that into action. Louis, could I ask you to chime in?
Yeah, actually, well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to highlight that I think that the only farmer here in this panel, so I will present you the perspective of a farmer. And for the introduction, I'd like just to remember some big numbers to show the big opportunity that we have to reduce methane emission as well as the other greenhouse gas emission. As we know, livestock is the sector that most use land in the world. I mean, 75% of the agricultural land is dedicated to animal protein and most for the livestock. So consider that we should stop deforestation. So the land that we should manage is the available land today. And so if this land is used 75% by the animal protein, most livestock, here is the opportunity. But more than that, it's important to remember that consumption of animal protein probably, and I really believe that it will increase it, for example, 10% the next decade. That's what the FAO is projecting. So we will need to produce more with the same land or even less land. The good news is that we have a huge opportunity because livestock sector, in average, has very low productivity. So it occupies a huge piece of land with very low productivity. And so once we can improve productivity, we can reduce a lot the greenhouse gas emission in the sector. And I can give you some numbers later. And besides that, I think that now, when compared with 5 or 10 years ago, we have technology like the feed additives, but we can elaborate more later about that.
Thank you. Donald, would you agree? Is it the moment?
Yeah, I love the way Elizabeth put it. It's the handbrake we can pull, but we need to make sure that when we pull the handbrake, we recognize that this is our ability to slow down climate change while we start to address issues of CO2 emissions, which build in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So we've got to start thinking this is a positive opportunity rather than a negative opportunity. Just want to build on a couple of things that Louis said as well. He mentioned that 75% of the world's agricultural land is dedicated to livestock, according to
animal protein in general.
Right, but 2/3 of the world's agricultural land, about 67%, according to the FAO, is permanent pasture, meadow, or savanna. The way that contributes to our food system is the grazing of livestock. So we can't just take livestock out of the equation. We need to find ways that we can improve livestock's performance. That brings me to the last stat I want to throw out here, and there'll be a test later, so write these down. 80% of the emissions in the dairy sector are coming from emerging markets. So, what I've heard in the conference so far today is an incredible emphasis on Europe and the developed or more developed markets, North America, etc. What we've got to do is we've got to recognize that in those emerging economies, they don't have the luxury that we have in dietary choice, etc. We need to be working with them to help them bring down emissions in their markets. And the strategies, the technologies, the practice change are much more basic than what we would see in the United Kingdom or in Europe.
80% of methane emissions.
80% of greenhouse gas emissions
GHG.
from the dairy sector, 67% of the 80% is methane.
And how do you expect that to change, given that protein demand in emerging economies is increasing? So
the biggest challenge in the emerging or developing markets is around productivity. We have very, very low yielding, very low producing. I'm in the dairy sector, right? So I'm going to talk dairy numbers at you. But, here in Europe, in UK, etc., we're averaging somewhere around about 1.2 to 1.4 kgs of CO2 equivalent per kg of milk. In parts of Africa, that's up to 16 to 18 kgs per kg of milk. So if you had $1 to invest in reducing emissions, and by the way, emissions don't know global boundaries. They don't know where the UK starts. It's a global issue. If you had $1 to invest, you would have a greater impact in the short term investing in emerging markets than investing in further reductions in the more developed economies.
And where do you think, Elizabeth, Andy, Louis, where do you think we're facing that bottleneck? Is it that we're not focused on emerging markets, as Donald said? Is it economics of it, technology? Where are the gaps right now, Elizabeth?
I think Andy's going to have a better answer on that one.
I think we take this approach of it takes this one's going to need 1,000 flowers to bloom, right? There's no silver bullet. There's no one thing that you do to reduce those emissions. We talk very generally about livestock. Livestock is incredibly diverse, right? And and there are very efficient systems in some parts of emerging economies, but there's also very inefficient systems in other parts. And so you need a range of approaches. So you've got the gig in town right now is kind of additives, feed additives. So you feed a cow kind of every day or every few days an additive which suppresses the methane and delivers reductions. That's great, but you need to see the cow regularly to give it. And many of the systems that are actually the least efficient right now, the farmer kind of puts the cow out to pasture and will come back and see it in 6 months' time. That's the reality of some of the systems, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and in many parts of Australia, is highly extensive systems that where you don't have that intervention point every day. So you need a big range of solutions. The thing that keeps me awake at night, I think a lot of our work we're looking and working with basically. It's interesting. This panel is fascinating because we've never said hi to these two people. I've spoken to them regularly, and we work with EDF on that sort of stuff. But working with partners to lay the groundwork, the foundation for a whole range of solutions. The thing that keeps me up at night is these extensive systems where you don't have that intervention point regularly, and that's where we lack options right now. We need to invest more on that. The problem is, again, it goes back, for those of you unfortunate enough to hear me on the first time I was up here, there's a market failure there. It's not an easy value proposition. Who's going to pay for that? And I think that's actually the biggest question in the whole methane moment is who pays for it? And, how do we incentivize a market for these kinds of products that can deliver global cooling when scaled?
And that kind of ties back, I know, Louis, you want to jump in, but kind of ties back to what Donald was saying as well, which is in emerging markets, cost is a huge factor. How do we make it more accessible and affordable for those markets? Louis, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, actually, I just like to add some numbers comparing or adding the numbers of the beef cattle once Donald put the numbers of the dairy. We have in Brazil, in the region where we have some farms, we developed a study to measure the average emission for the beef cattle production. So the number is around 50 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of meat carcass. So that's the average of the region where we operate. In the farms where we operate, the number is around 20 to 25, so less than half. And basically what we do, we improve productivity. We are not considering feed additives yet.
Okay.
And so by converting degraded pasture to high-intensive pasture, and even with the additional point that we use silvopastoral system, we even put more trees in the system, so there's the capture of the carbon by the trees. So we have a huge opportunity. So you can imagine that in average, a farm in Brazil, and remember, Brazil is the highest producer of beef in the world and the number one exporter of beef.
Yep.
The average is 1 head of cattle per hectare. In our farms, we have 3 heads of cows per hectare. The weight daily gain in average is 300 to 400 grams per cow per day. In our farms, we have 600 grams per cow per day. So when we use these 2 factors, we have a potential improving productivity of 4 to 5 times. So you can imagine an industry that only in Brazil uses 170 million hectares of land, and you can improve productivity by 4 to 5 times. There are no other industry with such a potential.
Can I ask a follow-up? So when we're improving productivity, are we keeping the overall output the same and reducing land, or are we also increasing output then as a result of that improved productivity?
Spoken like a true economist. I mean, it's a mix of those things. But look, I mean, the first of all, there's a reality of growing demand. That, I think you mentioned 10%. It's like to 2050, as much as 50% growth in animal source foods, right? So, that's going to drive more and more demand. It's driving deforestation. It's driving habitat loss. It's right now it's that's getting delivered in a very unsustainable manner.
Yeah.
I think there's in the kind of first instance, what we need to do is we need to, we can deliver that through productivity enhancement. So you can produce the same, you can produce double on half the land, basically, is what Louise is saying. It's phenomenal what those guys are doing there. And so if you can deliver that at scale across many of these extensive systems of Brazil, I mean, you can deliver this growing demand without deforesting another hectare and so on, and it's profitable for farmers and so on. I mean, in the long run, there's a bigger demand issue. I mean, like, when does it stop? And I guess, I spoke about that in the start of the session. I mean, for us, it's a yes and, even a question about
Yes.
but it's not just about what we need to make livestock more efficient, and we need to look at different ways of delivering what people want. And so I think you need to not throw anything out. Nothing should be thrown out in terms of options on this one. It's the biggest, in my opinion, and obviously I'm biased, but this is the biggest leverage point that you have in the entire kind of Earth system right now, in terms of land use, in terms of a huge chunk of wedge. And it's an industry that is, I hate to say it, highly inefficient in most parts of the world.
Yeah. Elizabeth.
Well, and it's yes, and I very much agree with what Andy is saying. This is the big opportunity, and I would say that companies have a huge role to play in driving that globally. Because clearly, from the stories here, it's going to be different in different places, in developing economies and elsewhere. Different strategies are needed, and companies have the ability to do that, but it has to be across the value chain with value creation. And I think it's not just risk reduction; it is business value creation. I always like to quote John Doerr to say that addressing climate change is the biggest business opportunity we have, and I think that is the case across the value chain here, and trying to kind of make sure there are benefits. And it's not easy, right? This is the challenge. How do you do that in ways that it is win-win? It's a structural issue, and you need governments and policy, but you also need companies. And I know, speaking from someone who's come from the United States, where we have a federal government that is going backwards, right? Like it just proves what I've spent my whole career doing, which is doing work with voluntary corporate action space. That's not going to solve it. It's not going to be everything, but having companies lead can help show the way, can help pave the way for regulation, can help do the R&D and the innovation and bring costs down. So I want companies to step up even more.
Yeah. And kind of what we were talking about with philanthropy as well, stepping in for the companies. Andy, to quote you from the previous session as well, to address market failures there. We've spoken about two solutions, increasing productivity and feed additives. Did anyone want to either add a little bit more on feed additives? Donald, do you want to jump in?
Some closing thoughts on the productivity issue. You know, we need to look in our rear view mirror and see where we've come from in Europe and so on. Where I'm going to get these numbers wrong, and I apologize to any Danes in the room, but from memory, it was something like in 1950, Denmark had just over 1 million cows. Today, they have less than half that number, producing 3 times the amount of milk. So productivity is your first step. How do we increase productivity? How do we produce more without increasing resources? And you'll certainly hit a point in time where we can then reduce cow numbers, which will start to really bring down. In Tanzania, we're doing pilots at the moment. We just completed some pilots in a relatively short time period with 3 basic interventions. We increased productivity by 25%, increased farm income 29%, reduced greenhouse gas emissions on an intensity basis by a little over 20%. And those 3 interventions were feed presentation, nothing different, chopping the feed, presenting it in a manger rather than dumping it on the floor, clean water, and some basic animal husbandry. So there are things we can be doing right now that will help tackle this moment that we face, in terms of reducing greenhouse gases.
Thank you. That's very clear, very succinct. So we talked about productivity. Feed presentation is interesting because we've talked about and we've given a lot of attention to feed additives. Would anyone like to say anything else about feed presentation? Have there been other examples here?
I'll jump in. One thing that I think is quite interesting that we've been looking at is, feed additives. Again, it's something. It comes, some of them come from seaweed. They come from all sorts of kind of sources. But it's like think of it as a pill that you eat every day to reduce, right? It doesn't work when you don't have that intervention, but something that we've been looking at, and it's quite fascinating, and actually this is where silvopastoral systems like Louise's come in. There are already things that cows eat that could be suppressing methane, so not all grasses, not all, leaves are made equal. Some of them contain the very compounds that can suppress the production of methane. So we can be looking at that. Can we breed grasses that are going to be containing more of those compounds so that when the cow is just chewing away on the pasture, they're getting basically the feed additive just naturally, right? So I think it's going back to nature, looking for these compounds in in grasses, in legumes, and so on, and introducing those into systems. I think that's a complementary, that's the equivalent way of doing it when you don't have that intervention point. And I think that's been completely underexploited as an area. But we're seeing there's like I don't know if Louise, you have leucaena in your right. So leucaena is a legume. It reduces. Latest research is it reduces 22% methane when that's being when cows are nibbling away at that. So just by planting that in your field, you're getting a 22% reduction. So there's simple stuff that can solve it as well.
Yeah, and I believe that from now and 10 years, there will be a lot of solutions and new technologies to reduce methane. Even with the feed additives, we have a huge potential. We have several products being developed now that reduce 70, 80, 90% of methane emission. So the challenge is how can we feed the cattle that additive? And I think it's not difficult. It's not difficult. I mean, just put a pill for the cow to eat. Even in a pasture-based system, you can do that. And there are many other technologies coming, so we have a huge space to reduce methane. And it's important to mention that regarding the productivity, we are not talking about rocket science. It's like Donald said, it's just improving the diet, improving the pasture, putting fertilizer, fences, clean water. So that's what we do in our farms. We have no rocket science behind our operation. We are doing what we consider the basics. So we have a huge space. And so when we add these potential new technologies like additives, I think that we will have a different scenario in the next 10 years. In Brazil, we were the first dairy farm to use a product called Bovaer that was the first feed additives. And because we have a small dairy operation there. But why we use that? Because it doesn't pay. It was a very expensive product. It will decrease the price, but at that time it was very expensive. The reason was because we had a specific milk brand called the no carbon milk that was the first certified carbon neutral milk. So we put the price in the final product. So if the consumer wants to have a carbon neutral product, the milk costs more. But for sure, I know that it's a niche market, very small niche market, still.
Donald,
just on the feed additives, just quickly, there's a great study, if you haven't seen it, came out by the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, where they looked at, I think it was 12 different products on the market, which were claimed to reduce methane. There's only 2 or 3 of them that actually did have a long-term impact, because we're dealing with a biological process in an animal's rumen, and it adjusts and it adapts, and sometimes it will revert again. So even if you continue, so we've got to be quite careful with the analysis and the long-term research that goes into it. But there are great resources out there for farmers in terms of advice. And you mentioned Bovaer. I think it's one that has the most scientific evidence behind it.
I'm sure there'll be lots of questions in the audience, but a couple of sort of additions to that. So Donald, you bring up a good point, which is to say there's going to be adjustments. And I know we heard from our panel, there's a lot of innovation already exists. Is it that we're innovating and we need to continue to do it, and we're focused on productivity, given that that's the quickest win, and then the rest will come later?
Well, the point that's been kind of sitting with me, and that I feel like I just have come to too late in my career in this space. We mentioned science and we mentioned technology. We're talking about all these interventions, and we need to talk about people too. And that piece is just so critical, because without that, we can't succeed. We have one study or one effort that we are working on in Minnesota in the United States, where I'm from. We engaged with Native Americans, the White Earth Nation, a band of Ojibwe tribe, to evaluate potential manure management solutions that reduce also local pollution concerns. So you get the co-benefits, if you want to call them, the win-win-win. So trying to co-develop and come up with solutions that, create business value, create economic value for the farmer across the value chain, address different impacts, climate impacts, but also local air pollution, local water pollution. This part is really critical. And just, since I mentioned Minnesota, I just have to say it. I think it's important for companies, especially those in Minnesota, to stand up and speak up for democracy and for the rule of law. It's important for companies to take leadership position on this most critical issue globally. So, especially in the U.S.
I mean, if I can jump in there, I think, you need companies to step up and start taking responsibility on their Scope 3 emissions. Louise can do it. So I think the big guys can do it, the multinationals. So,
yes.
So, and when that happens, that creates then the market signal for a lot of these technologies to actually have a real market. Right now we're involved in this because it's a market failure, because because no one's willing to pay for these things, or it's very difficult to get companies to be willing to pay for it. But I think, that's where companies need to step up. There's a few other things that we're looking at that don't necessarily need that. One is low methane genetics. We can start selecting for cows that just naturally emit less. There could be two cows that look the same. One will be farting and belching 30% more than the other one, right? So we can start selecting for that. And then there's the moonshot, right? The vaccine. So we've got some work on the vaccine. Can we create a vaccine which, is a one-shot wonder at the, when you're vaccinating cattle when they're born, that can suppress methane and have a full life impact there at a low cost. So there are other options there. We're investing in this kind of stuff, but you need companies to be sending the signal that, hey, there's a business opportunity in this, that will further develop the R&D and develop a product that then gets in front of the farmers.
All right. So we need to see more from companies and MNCs. Yes, Donald.
I was going to say, just building on what Andy's talking about, I love the moonshot, and we're working with one of the companies that's developing a methane vaccine. But what we've also got to bear in mind is if we want farmers to change, and just throw out some numbers again, there's somewhere between 112 and 130 million dairy farmers in the world. The average farm size is 2.9 cows. Now, I'm not sure what 0.9 of a cow looks like, but that's the average works out that way. But we have to create an economic value for them. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. And I shared the story about this little project we did in Tanzania with 800 farmers and, a 29% increase in income for them. A year later, about 10% of them weren't doing it. Mm-hmm. Right? So, what is it? Is it time? Is it, just motivate? What is it we've got to do to create that economic sustaining value for farmers? That, I think, is one of our biggest challenges. And a number of the products that we're talking about don't have a productivity gain for farmers. They're a cost. And if you haven't got a government or something like that that's willing to pay for it, or maybe a Bezos Earth Fund that's willing to pay for it, then how do the farmers get recompensed for that? Lewis mentioned how expensive some of those interventions are. We need to find a sustaining economic model. Yeah. Might be carbon markets. Might be.
Yeah, I think that carbon markets could be an opportunity. Yeah. And we are already using this opportunity of the carbon market. We are even developing a new methodology. It's the final stage of approval by Vera that would generate potential carbon credits based on the improvement of the productivity. So that would be a really support for the farmer to adopt a system that produce with less carbon. So, and if we consider the huge potential of this industry of reducing emissions, so you can see that we have a huge opportunity in the carbon market. So that's what we are looking for, and I think that it will be the future.
That's interesting. Yeah, the carbon markets, along with all the other solutions, I think. We're almost at time. So I guess one key takeaway for the audience from each of you in maybe 40 seconds or less. So, Donald, what would you want the audience, I'm going to start from that side. What would you want the audience to remember from this discussion?
Two things I would like you to remember. The first is the size of the elephant in the corner of the room, which is the emerging market. So the issues we've got to address there, whether it's nutritional security, livelihoods, economic growth, or environmental outcomes, there's a huge issue there. And the second one is we've got to have incentives, or we've got to create a productivity incentive for farmers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just like to remember that the livestock sector is probably, in terms of land use, the best opportunity that we have in the short term to reduce emission. There is no other sector with such potential. And it seems not so logical to say that livestock can be the best contributor to the climate change fight. But at the end of the day, it seems it is. And I'm not here to make an advocacy of consumption of beef and milk. I'm just being pragmatic.
Mm-hmm. Andy?
Well, I'll deal with the cow in the room, and there's lots of votes.
Yeah,
is anyone willing to admit that we need to massively reduce livestock farming globally to realistically reduce methane emissions? I'm super comfortable saying it's a yes and problem. Yeah. Yes, we need to reduce the kind of the footprint of livestock on planet Earth, and we need to make what we have in livestock more efficient. So it's do it better on less land.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and companies are a really key part of this in terms of showing innovation, like our Dairy Methane Action Alliance, which is a number of leading companies such as Danone, Starbucks, Bell Brands, doing what needs to be done to push things, to show the way, the innovation. They can do what is needed to, especially in the absence of regulation, to send a very clear demand signal for change. And they can do what is needed to then ultimately support regulatory reform and a solid foundational base of strong laws.
Yeah. All right, lots to talk about, I'm sure, but thank you to our panel for just helping us, just get a sense of what we can do, and hopefully we'll keep this going and hear next year what other solutions we've come up with. Thank you, Donald, Louis, Andy, and Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.